Hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk entitled Exuberant Embodiment, a Trans Utopia for an Unbearable Present, which is based on an essay forthcoming in the Journal of the Society for Utopian Studies early next year. So I'm going to give a brief overview before getting into the content of what I'll be talking about. In the United States, those of us in marginalized communities are beginning to be confronted by the dire consequences of the 2024 presidential election. Immigrants, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, feminist, queer, trans, and disabled people, and the non-human worlds are indeed under siege as they brace for a nation transformed by Project 2025, the much feared theocratic and autocratic conservative mandate for leadership. However, in this talk, I'm going to ask you to take another path of thought beyond the very important fights for rights taking place in the courts. For example, a very important Supreme Court case being argued today on whether trans people have equal rights under the law. These are also crucial, but what I want to say is that these grim conditions present an opportunity for utopian thinking that is both critical and educated, not as a means to deny or suppress these conditions or our feelings about them, but as resistance to their normalization. The danger in an autocratic, theocratic regime is forgetting and denial. It's a kind of coping mechanism, but one that can stall an imaginative, engaged response. Using Jose Muñoz's Cruising Utopia as a guide, I present one vision for a trans utopia, which I center on what I'm calling exuberant embodiment, which signifies the abundant, overflowing quality of complete bodily autonomy for all. This vision requires resistance to the nature human and nature technology dualisms that justify capitalist exploitation of the body. Through an archive of contemporary trans and crip sculpture and painting, I offer practices of resistance and objects for contemplation toward anti-capitalist utopian futures. So this is our menu of what we'll be talking about. Part 1, Under Siege, Post-Election USA. Part 2, Trans Utopia Against Normalization, in which I'll present in a very general way the theoretical ground for this vision of a trans utopia. In Part 3, I'll discuss art as resistance, focusing on the sculptures of Gwen Lambert Kelling and the painter Riva Lehrer. And in the conclusion, Toward an Uncertain Future, this will not wrap things up in a bow, but should feel agitating and unsettling, and as a spark for action. So Part 1, the USA Under Siege. There is a growing understanding that for the American far right, eradication of transness is the goal. And the persecution and even eradication of people with disabilities. This is not hyperbole, but a very realistic appraisal of what Jose Muñoz in Cruising Utopia calls the poisonous and insolvent present. After the 2024 election, there is this feeling of being under siege, which I tried to capture in this slide. Just this deluge of headlines that are absolutely terrifying and very difficult to put into scale, and also very difficult to emotionally and intellectually tolerate, which is part of the regime's strategy. So planned federal crackdowns on transness will likely take many forms, and ultimately the goal is to make being trans in public a crime. Trump's remarks about people with disabilities, Harris being sort of attacked as having mental illness, quote unquote, policy plans suggest utter hostility to bodies that do not conform to the white, privileged, able-bodied, and assigned male norm. Given these escalating and relentless threats to our safety, despair feels inevitable. But Muñoz warned against the pessimism that comes from myopic submersion in the present catastrophes, as though they are inevitable and there is nothing that can be done. So Part 2, Trans Utopia Against Normalization. So why utopia? Paradoxically, perhaps, utopia becomes more critical in times of crisis for at least two reasons. First, utopianism guards against the normalization of the predatory capitalist systems oriented toward death, which are driving these policies. And second, visions of a different future allow us to judge the distance between our current reality and the one for which to hope and work. My vision rejects the present reality for all who are denied bodily autonomy. The list at this point in history is lengthy. To entertain a vision is an imaginative act. So I want to go on that journey together and to consider exuberant embodiment, which means all bodies are free to be as they are without threat of social exclusion and death. So why did I choose this word exuberant? It has a multi-layered meaning. It can mean of humankind, quote, of affections, joyous emotions, vitality, health, which we're going to complicate that word, overflowing, abounding, and of nature, growing luxuriantly, produced in superabundance or excess. We will see human and non-human futures as interdependent in this talk. So I'm basing my vision in the idea of the awakening of the senses which are dulled by predatory capitalism, which I'll explain, and changing how we view sexuality as not just about genitalia, but about heterogeneous ways of experiencing the body and the mind, in line with Black feminist Audre Lorde's understanding of the creative and intellectual potential of the erotic. A newly invigorated principle of pleasure leads to the acknowledging of the human organism in its fullness. The destructive technologies, the destructive technological tendencies that lead to the violent domination of nature become no longer desirable as technology becomes part of the spontaneous play of being alive. Our sense of time expands, expanding also the potential for playfulness, regarding for some the bliss of early childhood when gender is less fixed and sexual ways of relating to oneself and others are expansive. This idea of scarcity, which I'll be unpacking, is discredited. This is the false idea that there are not enough resources to feed and clothe the entire planet. In reality, as we know, scarcity is caused by gross global wealth inequality. Exuberant embodiment and the freeing of the energetic capacities of the body and mind result from this bold realignment of civilization. We're going to focus a bit on how this word realignment needs to be re-envisioned. So this vision is also based on my concept of unruly alliances from my book, Masculinity in Transition, which came out from the University of Minnesota Press in 2023. In which I describe human and non-human bonds across categories, which may be temporary, informal, and form in response to crises. Unruly alliances can scale up and scale down to address the need for care on a most basic level, as well as the consequences of the ecological crises, political suppression, and economic injustice. The actualization of utopia depends upon togetherness and not in the sense that the far right intends, which is an important distinction that I'll be pursuing in my next monograph, which I'm currently planning, and that will be called Unruly Alliances, Cultures and Politics of Liberation. Mass movement is necessary if utopian thinking is to be transformed into historical and material action. So this is not utopian theorizing just for the sake of it, but it's actually thinking about art and cultural production as the spark for that historical and material action. So I was asked to write this essay. This was a sort of prompt challenging me to think about a trans-utopia in relation to Muñoz's Cruising Utopia, which I reread after not having read it for a while. I was very moved once again by Muñoz's theorizing of a queer utopia based on resistant bodies in community with one another through art making practices, through literature and visual art and so on, and performance. And I'm still very captivated by the concept of a horizon that breaks with traditional ideology and thinking. Expansive, bold, and transformative vision that Muñoz becomes a template for my own thinking. However, I depart from Muñoz in certain ways and from queer theory more general And need to sort of recall that since the 1990s, queer theory has been suspicious of trans people, due in part to their supposed reliance on technology to change their gender. This true view of the trans body as unnatural also fuels a range of anti-trans movements, gender critical views, for example, in Europe and elsewhere, and of course, the far right in the United States and beyond. Queer theory historically has drawn a line between queer gender radicals. Kevin Aviance, who's pictured here, who Muñoz writes about, is one example of someone who's bending gender, at least in that time period. There's a line between queer gender radicals and trans people who use so-called technology to become men or women, quote unquote, within the gender binary. Trans philosophers, however, trans theorists, trans philosophers, one in particular, Talia May Betcher, writes about how in trans subcultures, the meanings of masculine and feminine, or man and woman, are contested and reworked within an array of embodiments. So it's sort of challenging this idea of transness as this monolith, and that there's this pull toward this reactionary pull, if you will, toward the gender binary. And this brings up this false dichotomy between the wrong body model and the beyond the binary model, which persists as the two types of stories a trans person is allowed to tell about themselves. In the wrong body model, medicine and psychiatry label the trans person as suffering from a medical condition which is cured through genital reconstructive surgery, and this is the historical model. In the newer version of the story, one's real sex is determined by gender identity, which affirms what one has been inside all along. Queer and feminist studies have at times used this model to label trans people as dupes of the binary gender system, which prompts queer scholar Kaji Amin to say that it's time to stop imposing, quote, the grid of queer values on trans lives, with its clear preference for gender bending, or the more recent queer trans understandings of transness. So this kind of is coupled with the critique or erasure of material concerns of trans people, which has been another issue. So trans theorists like Cameron Awkward-Rich, Vivian Namaste in the early 2000s insist that, quote, normativity, stability, belonging, beauty, sexiness, and money are not reactionary desires as they've been labeled. Queer theorists deny in a certain way through this the brutal material realities for trans subjects under capitalism, nor is gender and sex boundary crossing by itself a politically or intellectually radical act, as Amin notes. All this to say, while I was asked to write a piece about trans utopia while revisiting Muñoz, I found that transness was generally absent, and that when it was present, it was approached as not radical enough in some ways that I found subtle but important to point out. So I wanted to also just introduce the definition of trans that I've been working with my Intro to Trans Studies class on. Like, this is the definition that I've come to embrace. And this is from the article Times to Come, Materializing Trans Times in Transgender Studies Quarterly by Jian Neo Chen and Misha Cardenas. We use the term trans to recognize multiple embodiments, expressions, and identities of gender nonconformity and variance that surpass and potentially decolonize racially constituted white binary gender sex while maintaining links to transgenders' resistant repurposing of Western psychomedical science and to trans's broad inclusiveness based on the algorithmic command to trans everything. So I think that this definition really opens a lot of space that historically anyway, queer theory had limited. And I think this is what prompts me to think that trans studies is the one of the future edges that our fields of gender and sexuality studies are forging ahead with. So what needs to happen given these views of the unnaturalness of the trans body? The dismantling of the human nature and human technology dualisms become of central importance. The redefinition of both nature and technology are also needed so that the vastness of the human and non-human worlds can be valued and protected. And including disability in a meaningful way is very important, as it has been ignored in utopian, queer, and trans studies. In Brilliant Imperfection, Eli Clare writes, the human and non-human monocultures drive a cisgender ableist fantasy in which the chaos and unknowns of the non-human realms of nature become a source of terror rather than of contemplation and responsible use. Through the image of the agribusiness monoculture, Eli Clare, featured here in this very well-loved portrait by Rivellere, challenges us to consider how human monocultures are created when disability and transness are unchosen as undesirable embodiments through a variety of means: genetic testing, painful and debilitating so-called cures, and more. He writes, quote, "The act of choosing disability in the white Western world is never neutral, simply one choice among many, but rather pathologized, shamed, or sensationalized. In contrast, unchoosing disability is celebrated and framed as a collective imperative. Choosing disability means choosing messiness, imperfection, and being a work in progress for Clare. Interdependence over individuality, receptivity over productivity. In summary, a trans utopia cannot replicate the ableist monocultural imperative of a predatory capitalist society or the more sort of eugenicist views of utopia of the past, nor repeat the beyond the binary and born in the wrong body impasses. Disability and transness can be chosen outside of conventional understandings of health or the able-disabled dualism, for the opposite of a monoculture is a polyculture, a pluralistic, interdependent community. So as Susan Stryker, trans historian, established decades ago, the so-called natural body is only attained at the expense of the so-called unnatural one. In other words, if there is one type of body that is considered the holy grail, if you will, the assigned male, privileged, able white body, then all the others are unnatural and thus deviant. Muñoz's distancing of queerness from technology and Clare's monoculture convey how the human relationship to so-called nature and non-human animals must be understood differently. When trans and crip subjects are cast as uniquely dependent on technology and or as undesirable bodies that should unchoose their embodiment, once again, this ideal body is reinstalled at the top of these hierarchies. Our interrelationship with technology, I feel, should be intuitive at this point, that to shorthand the cyborg manifesto of Donna Haraway, we are all cyborgs. This means the distinctions between nature human, nature technology, human non-human, as well as urban rural, etc., are pure fictions, as advanced by post-humanist philosopher Francesca Ferrando, who offers the example of numerous plants in the so-called wilderness that were placed there by our ancestors, did not spring up spontaneously from some Garden of Eden. In her series Mirror Shards, Rivellere, artist, writer, and curator, conveys through her paintings the dissolving of these binaries, and in particular, how the merging of the human with the symbols and metaphors of another being allows for both, quote, self-knowledge and a release from the self, a process in which the concern is no longer only for the human. What emerges is an understanding of interrelationship. A cyborg is a being with both organic and mechanical body parts, or a person whose physiological functioning is aided by a mechanical or electronic device, which includes many people with disabilities. The term is a combination of the words cybernetic and organism. Trans artist Gwen Kelling, whose work we'll see in a moment, explains how the trans body is not deviant, but rather a sign of our evolution as a species. Quote, "We are merging our senses and physiologies with ever-evolving technological augmentations. The expectations of what our bodies can look like and accomplish will always be subject to change." So this is not to obscure the obvious abuses of technology and the technosphere under capitalism within the Anthropocene, but rather to say that under predatory capitalism, our relationship to the natural and technological is flawed and dangerous. If these are understood to be part of us in the reverse, then these categories of unnatural and unproductive lose their meaning and hold. So this is my overly simplified capitalism slide, but all this leads to the conclusion: exuberant embodiment, that overflowing, abundant, non-ableist image we began with, can only manifest if the energetic capacities of body minds are freed. To use Claire's term, body mind with a hyphen. Capitalism values profits over beings. It demands that the capacities of the body and mind are drained, as demonstrated by the brutality of the US healthcare system that routinely bankrupts its customers, the lack of nutritious and affordable food that is not subject to the poisonous practices of agribusiness, and so on. In the spirit of unruly alliances, the ground for a trans utopia, and also the unruly alliance between trans and queer studies, is the radical critique of predatory capitalism. So I wanted to go back into some of Muñoz's inspirations within the Frankfurt School and within German idealism. And so I decided to look back at Herbert Marcuse's Eros and Civilization. So Marcuse was a Frankfurt School thinker whose work mainly dealt with the idea of art as the rupture in the society that can fuel transformation. And like Ernst Bloch and Adorno, Marcuse grappled with utopia within the Marxist tradition. So there are two concepts that I want to propose are important to understand: surplus repression and performance principle, and especially how they play a role in the rise of authoritarian movements and totalitarian regimes, what we are seeing now. Material and psychic realities caused by these two mechanisms, which they're interrelated, are shared by many minoritized groups in particular. So thus, they can be critiqued toward a common utopian vision. They call attention to the processes and mechanisms by which capitalism drains the body-mind's energetic capacities, also therefore draining the potentiality for resistance, which, as those of us living through the moment in the US especially know, is one of the Trump administration's goals, is to suppress opposition in all of its forms. So surplus repression revised Freud's thinking that our instincts have to be repressed in order for culture/civilization to not descend into primitive chaos. But Marcuse argues that what we see now goes well beyond this basic repression that Freud theorized. The patriarchal family is a prime example of this surplus repression, along with restrictions on what he calls the minor senses, such as smell and taste, with the goal of desexualizing the body, making it more exploitable for labor. Surplus repression goes beyond the life instincts and thus is also in alignment with the forces of destruction. And it is a tool of the performance principle, which structures life around productivity above everything and stratifies and separates society based on economic competition. As far as the ideology of the traditional family, the performance principle makes non-procreative sexuality appear deviant. Alongside the family, there is the idea that the struggle for existence takes place in a world too poor for the satisfaction of human needs, at least not without restraint, renunciation, and delay. In such a world, Marcuse writes, quote, pleasure is suspended and pain prevails. Here we can see how for Marcuse, the human and natural worlds are linked. Quote, the aggressive impulses of provide energy for the continuous alteration, mastery, and exploitation of nature to the advantage of mankind. In attacking, splitting, changing, pulverizing things and animals, and periodically also men, man extends his dominion over the world and advances to ever richer stages of civilization. These destructive forces are then unleashed both on so-called natures and multiple and multiplying enemy figures. However, Marcuse argues these principles are outdated. The fact that the amount of wealth and resources in the world could satisfy all human needs should make this apparent. There is enough, more than enough wealth to relieve the world of poverty, which means it is now a problem of distribution. The lie of scarcity, I'm kind of renaming it the lie of scarcity, is simply no longer credible. While it is a very effective tool for the controlled populations. So why are these ideas so threatening today? Because it would invalidate productivity as one of the central tenets of modern culture. Claire understands productivity as one of the mechanisms for discrimination against people with disabilities who have been historically described as waste humanity, as well as trans folks, not mutually exclusive categories here, who are not reproductive bodies, at least in the minds of anti-trans views. Totalitarianism comes in here, and I'm using this term very loosely, but because societies must invent increasing restraints on the body to justify capitalist exploitation and the lie of scarcity. So again, in a shorthand way, totalitarianism describes the planned takeover of the US into a system of government that is centralized and dictatorial and requires complete subservience to the state. And I want to be very clear that this is what is being planned, regardless of what we might name it, which we could argue over that for certain. Productivity at some point must be turned against the individual, which keeps people in a permanent state of fear of enemy outsiders, both internally and externally. So in this scenario, the trans subject, particularly the racialized trans subject, becomes not just an enemy, but what Marcuse calls, quote, an arch enemy, an antichrist who appears everywhere at all times. The enemy represents hidden and sinister forces, and their omnipresence requires total mobilization. So I want to point to the idea of transvestigation, which is a very insidious practice of calling out any kind of sign of non-normative gender and accusing people of transness based on that. It's very terrifying, and I have some students who are writing about it, and it's something that I think compels us to broaden our understanding of trans and also to fight against some of these practices, all of these practices. So the totalitarian state dissolves any difference between war and peace, between civilian and military populations, and between truth and propaganda. So you might be asking, where is the utopianism in Marcuse? This all sounds very dark. Some part of our brains remembers freedom from the forces of the performance principle and surplus repression. Exactly the sensibilities that are used to make art. Daydreaming and the imagination allow us to remember freedom from repression carried over into adulthood from childhood, along with memories of the collective spirit of unruly alliances, which is important for a lot of my work. So this part of our psyche is drawn to harmony between individual and world, body and mind, human and techne, and it remembers utopia, in Marcuse's words, quote, the idea that behind the illusion lies knowledge, end quote. And because Marcuse grounds his idea in a realistic view of what is possible, it is possible to redistribute resources, to use technology for the greater good of all, to decenter traditional family ideology, and make space for a variety of embodiments for complete bodily autonomy for all. So on to the art as resistance. So one of the other aspects of Muñoz that I was once again really compelled by is this idea of using images to transform how we envision ourselves and our societies, and that this is of critical importance to discredit the performance principle. New cultural images must replace those based in fantasies of mastery, subjugation, and elimination, ones that are grounded in the sense of community and unruly alliances. So following Marcuse's lead in chapter 8, Muñoz found utopian potential in images of Orpheus and Narcissus as representations of joy and fulfillment, rest and contemplation. In Marcuse's words, there must be images that offer worlds, quote, not to be mastered and controlled, but to be liberated, a freedom that will release the powers of pleasure and imagination now bound in the repressed and petrified forms of man and nature, end quote. So Orpheus represents the power of poetry and song, as well as the pleasures of homosexuality. He is the poet liberator. Narcissus is re-envisioned as not the disease of self-involvement with which we associate him, but as we commonly understand, but of this before time of oneness with the universe and oneself, of water and movement as well. So in what follows, we're going to focus just on Narcissus and this process of self-reflection, which the regime does not want you to engage in, because should you self-reflect, the headline slide kind of, again, paints a picture of the affective environment that we're living in right now, then you just might realize the lie. So Gwen Kelling's sculptures are self-reflective. In Equestrian, Kelling conjures the brutal reality of Prometheus and the imprisoning normative masculinity he promotes, in line with surplus repression and the performance principle. A cast iron encasement based on the torso of the so-called ideal equestrian archetype is set on a steel hinge so that the front and back of the body open to reveal a hollow interior. The encasement sits on two steel workbenches with wooden tops, which are about 2 feet high, allowing the viewer to observe at eye level the posterior and anterior portions of this archetype simultaneously, offering how the masculine ideal is unstable despite its iron exterior shell. Once inside the encasement, one can see tick marks, the kind scratched onto a prison wall or a table in high school detention. These marks suggest that Kelling has been marking time while trapped within, and thus this liberation has been paid for dearly by her body-mind. Other photos, which Kelling has generously agreed to share, has offered to us, shows the tick marks imprinted on the skin of her thigh and belly, creating their own groove-like etchings. In the spirit of Narcissus, her now visibly feminine, freed body emerges out of an imaginative, sustained attention to her own existence. And this goes along with some ideas of withdrawal present in Awkward Rich's book, The Terrible We. I wanted to point out that connection. This period, perhaps both meditative and excruciating, has provided her with reserves of energy to challenge surplus repression and the performance principle, and her own womanhood within and beyond them. The message here is that while the encasement appears to be welded shut, while politics appears to be stuck, both can be unhinged and dismantled. However, Kelling also directly confronts anti-trans violence and the need for community, which means her utopian vision never detaches from the poisonous and insolvent present. This dual movement of acknowledging what is and envisioning what can be is the essence of an educated rather than a naive or facile utopia. Sanitary Standard imagines how a decorative bronze post at drinking fountain height, crowned with 2 water spouts held in a shell-like bowl, can become a washing station used to clear and recalibrate the user's perception. This tool for bias removal has wide implications, as it can dispel all kinds of visually produced stigmas against surplus repression and the performance principle. Moreover, once cleansed of these misperceptions, each user becomes acquainted with the intimate harmony of their own being. And so as to not draw a conclusion that this is an ableist image, I think it's the spirit of cleansing that is most important here, and the spirit that this can take place through a work of art, through engagement with a work of art, which also could include other senses as well. So now we're going to move on to Riva Lair. Her subject has always been what she calls the socially challenged body, stigmatized because of physical embodiment, sexuality, or gender identity. And she too captures the spirit of Narcissus. Her subjects are always solitary, engaged in intense self-reflection, while at the same time in conversation with the world around them. In this series, Mirror Shards, the human subject's willingness to release the self in these shamanistic scenes also suggests the possibility of another world. In Jessica Hyena, a feminine figure crouches on the ground, her long dark blonde hair tangled around the magical hyena mask, with its sharp teeth curved in a deep growl. The figure is Jessica Johnson, a fellow artist and animal rescue worker. Dark clouds gather ominously behind her, obscuring a cerulean sky, suggesting a moment of great danger. But the clouds also propose regeneration, as according to Ferrando, quote, clouds play a key role in hydrologic cycles. The rain emerging from them is necessary to life on Earth. Similarly, when we are aware, preconceptions act like great reminders of the work to be done on ourselves and in our societies. At the same time, the desert background refers to the processes of desertification and habitat destruction, and the clouds are not yet producing rain. This suggests a transitional or even transformational moment of utopian possibility. Our relationship to predators is also reconsidered in this image, as Jessica appears unafraid of the hyena with whom she has merged. And in fact, she reaches her hand toward the top of the animal's head, as though she were about to stroke it with affection. To further accentuate the emotional power and even difficulty of this merger, colorful pieces of paper that Jessica has shredded are then eaten and rejected by the hyena mask, creating a rainbow cloud of disorder. She clutches a red piece of paper in her opposite hand, which for me connotes the willful human damage to the earth and to ourselves, for which we all bear some responsibility. Jessica identifies as straight and cisgender, but the portrait very much communicates the expansion, as I mentioned earlier, of how trans can be thought and lived within this utopian vision. Blair sees in Jessica a different kind of femininity than what is expected, thus the choice of the hyena as her mirror. The female hyena is very difficult to differentiate from the male because she has the largest proportional clitoris known to exist in the non-human animal worlds. Despite Lair's description, Jessica's gender cannot be defined as strictly cis, and this is especially true since the overall result of the piece, in Lair's words, is the appearance of, quote, a hermaphroditic figure that comes apart even as it comes together. The binary gender mandate grounded in so-called nature dissolves, along with the ruse of the human separation from the non-human, depicted also through the tale that is now part of Jessica. So now moving on to the conclusion toward an uncertain future. When the present feels the most resistant to change, the most intractable, utopian thought becomes the most critical. Pessimism threatens to saturate our lives, facilitating our descent into apathy and ignorance, much to the delight of the literal armed guardians of the performance principle. Utopian means the spirit of activating the imagination and unveiling knowledge in this piece, the recovery of the truth that things don't have to be this way. The recovery of memory, of past struggles, of our pluralistic sensibilities is of utmost importance, as we are witnessing in the United States disinformation and censorship are tools for forgetting, enabling the creation of multiple enemy figures. In Marcuse's words, one is forced to remember, quote, duties rather than pleasures, bad conscience, guilt and sin, unhappiness and the threat of punishment, not happiness and the promise of freedom linger in memory. Trans subjects are the supposed arch enemies of the patriarchal family structure and of white cis womanhood and girlhood in particular. Consequently, trans women have been associated with and subjected to death in multiple ways. In the United States, in the grip of a white Christian nationalist takeover, which will be truly deadly for trans and crip people and a large portion of the population, pleasure belongs to the hereafter, to life after death in heaven, only for some. Trans and crip bodies and all who are non-compliant with the surplus repression of white Christian nationalist ideology become irrelevant and expendable. The uncertain future begins to look more and more like a security state dystopia. But what if a state of satisfaction, of plenty, were to replace this fear-mongering about scarcity, the nature-human, nature-technology dualisms that drive transphobia and ableism, and the relentless drive for productivity through which certain populations are labeled waste humanity? Destructive forces would be seen for what they are, the result of ever-tightening constraints that aim to divert attention away from the outdatedness of the performance principle and its handmaiden anthropocentrism. That is, the total focus on the human over and beyond the non-human, the plants, animals, and entire ecosystems, interdependent with human life. Transutopia is on the side of movement and change, of continuing renewing paradise, which is a word I interrogate in my essay, in heterogeneous ways. It is the return to song, play, beauty, and contemplation, to the choosing of our body minds with all of the maladjustment that comes with them. Thank you so much for listening. And if you would like to contact me or see more of my work, you can go to my website or follow me on Instagram. Thank you so much.